the Taliban is an armed insurgency. ISIL is a terrorist group, so we don't make concessions to terrorist groups.
White House spokesman Eric Schultz trying to distinguish between our trade with the Taliban for Sergeant Bo Bergdahl and Jordan's talks with ISIS to swap a failed suicide bomber for a captured Jordanian pilot. And it's time now for our Sunday group, syndicated columnist George Will, Julie Pace, who covers the White House for the Associated Press, co-host of The Five, Dana Perino, and Peter Baker of the New York Times. George, this seemed to me to be the week when all of the fine distinctions that the White House tries to make between an armed insurgency and terror and Islamic extremists, when all of that came tumbling down, not only the generals that I talked about in the first segment, but also big strategic thinkers like former Secretaries of State Henry Kissinger and George Shultz, all told Congress that we don't have a plan. We don't have a strategy to defeat Islamic extremism.
I think that's a fair criticism, but it's also fair to say try and build a strategy. Begin with this. The President wants, and Congress evidently wants, to pass a new authorization for the use of military force. Try and write one. Who are we fighting and where are we fighting them? Particularly this week we learned that ISIL, we haven't even agreed on the term, is now in Libya, a failed state that our policy has created. Second, our big success so far militarily is beating ISIL away from the border town in Syria of Kobane. To do that, we use 75% of all of our airstrikes since September for that one small achievement. Third, we seem to be agreed politically and for other reasons that there are not going to be any significant U.S. ground troops involved. Fourth, that throws us back on the regional powers. The Washington Post reports this week that some of the training done for the Iraqi army is afflicted with such shortages of ammunition and weapons that they go through their training exercises shouting bang, bang, instead of firing weapons. That's the mess from which we're supposed to construct a strategy.
Julie, how do they respond at the White House to what seems, and let's put that map up. I really think you can't get enough of looking at that map, the fact that Islamic extremism, from Al-Qaeda to ISIS to Iran, is on the march.
They don't necessarily argue that there aren't more groups out there. They argue that the threat that those groups pose to U.S. interests in the homeland in particular is far less than it was when you were talking about core al-Qaeda basically in Afghanistan and Pakistan. You know, to pick up on some of George's points, I think what's so interesting about the strategy that the White House says that they have here is that so much of it is out of their control. You know, Yemen has really been the example that Obama has pointed to, where he says, we have our counterterrorism campaign, we launched drone strikes against al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, and we're coordinating with this government. Well, that government doesn't exist anymore. And when you're dealing in these countries that have such instability in them, we just don't have control over the pieces that we say need to be in place in order for these strategies to succeed.
But, you know, Dana, I mean, I'm hearing a lot about the problem, but we can't just let them grow and build. I mean, this feels to me in certain ways like the 1990s when you had, and everybody was aware of, maybe not worried about, al-Qaeda building training camps, comments, incendiary comments from bin Laden, and then suddenly 9/11 happened. I mean, at a certain point, you have to confront it, don't you? So
we are a lot better as a nation of confronting terror and trying to get in front of it and prevent terror attacks than we were on September 10th, 2001. But that complacency, that worry that, okay, we haven't had an attack in a while on the homeland, that in terms of a catastrophic attack, that things are better, then the White House, I think, is in this rhetorical box. And they're trying to make sure that they can say that, well, the president has fundamentally changed foreign policy. He has gotten us out of 2 wars. In the meantime, if you look at that map, the other troubling thing is that you have ISIS now in Afghanistan, Taliban joining up with ISIS in the border regions. And so I hope that we're not returning to a situation like we were on September 10th. But I think that's why you had so many people come out this week publicly and say, we are alarmed, Mr. President, we also want to help you, and I think that he should take them up on that.
Peter, you had a tough piece in the New York Times yesterday in which you reported that Netanyahu, when we talked earlier about the split over Netanyahu accepting Boehner's offer to speak to Congress, that Netanyahu and Obama have basically given up on each other and suggesting that U.S.-Israeli relations could be in the deep freeze if Netanyahu gets reelected in March could be in the deep freeze for the next 2 years.
Yeah, it does look like that. Look, reflects 6 years of scar tissue at this point is being picked at, and it's not about a speech. It's about a very different worldview between these two leaders. President Obama obviously would love to find some way of having a rapprochement with Iran. He feels that would make the region, in fact, we've talked about that map, even safer if they could get Iran back into the community of nations on some level. And Prime Minister Netanyahu lives in the region, and he looks at that every day and says, this is an existential threat to my country. And they're talking past each other at this point. And so all the small things, like whether you give a speech or not, end up causing a much bigger rift. And I think that you're right. I think Prime Minister Netanyahu's basically decided that Republicans in Congress are his way to go at this point. I think President Obama looks at the March 17th election, thinks maybe there's a chance we get a different government in there, and if not, frankly, they've made clear they don't want to even work with Prime Minister Netanyahu's ambassador here in Washington.
But Dana, isn't that dangerous? I mean, to a certain degree, everybody. I mean, one of the unified issues on which Republicans and Democrats stood was support for the state of Israel. If this now becomes a political issue, where Netanyahu, and I'm not saying who's responsible, but Netanyahu is basically throwing in with the Republican Congress against the president, isn't that bad for the U.S. and for Israel?
I think it takes away from the fact that we all have a similar goal, which is that Iran should not be allowed to have a nuclear weapon with which to have power over the entire region and possibly destroy Israel. That's their stated claim. I would hope that the rift could actually be smoothed over, and I think that it takes big leaders to be able to say, all right, I might not like you personally, but I know we've got to work together. And I don't think that waiting until March 17th for a new government is a good idea. A new government takes a while to get established. In the meantime, Iran is playing out the clock. And so I would hope that they would take the opportunity to figure it out. And I think the Congress is going to work on this deal. They'll come to some sort of agreement between Kirk Menendez and Corker and get something that the president can use in the negotiations.
Julie?
Well, in some ways, the Iran deal is going to force the U.S. and Israel to at least be aware of each other on this playing field in some way. If there is a deal, Israel is going to have to decide whether they accept the terms of the deal or whether they try to move ahead on their own, perhaps with some kind of military action. The more dangerous situation, I think, is if there is no deal, and then basically the U.S. and Israel have to decide what's next. Do we just try to continue with sanctions and restart diplomacy at another point? Or is this the time for military action? And if the U.S. and Israel are not on the same page on that, it creates a very difficult situation, not just for our two countries, but for the region.
All right. We have to take a break here, but we'll see you all a little later.